Hello, everybody. What is up, and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, your host here at Crimes Untold, and today we're going to be talking about the murder of Gordon Ray Church, which is going to sound exactly similar, or not exactly similar, but very similar to another crime that would happen approximately 10 years after this, which I kind of talk about a little bit. So, who is Gordon Ray Church? So, Gordon Ray Church was born to David and Nancy Church, and he grew up within a devout LDS family or Latter-day Saints family in the community of Delta, Utah. So, while growing up in a devoutly religious household, it's going to have ups and downs, especially if you're different. In this case, Gordon is different. You see, he is homosexual, and sometimes within LDS families or within religious families, they kind of frown upon it, or they just try not to acknowledge it. They look the other way. And he was different. And if you're different from everybody else, you're going to experience the ups and downs in your family. So Gordon was different, like I mentioned. He was homosexual and he wanted to live his life. He wanted to try new things. He wanted to explore things that weren't the norm for him and his family. So he would go on to attend Southern Utah University. He would meet a ton of friends there that wouldn't judge him. And it really helped open his eyes to the world. So, on the evening of November 22nd of 1988, Gordon and his friend Kathy Long, his really good friend from what I gather and what I read, and two other friends, they decided they wanted to meet up for a quick dinner prior to going home to celebrate the upcoming holiday, Thanksgiving, with their families. So Gordon would stop at a 7-Eleven that's on South Main Street and he would go pick up some cigarettes prior to going to dinner with his friends. But unfortunately, when the time to meet up would come and go, he wouldn't show. So after about 2 hours had transpired or had gone by, these friends decided to go ahead and they had their dinner anyway. They didn't think about calling the police quite yet, but it wasn't like him to not show up. He was an extremely dependable friend that would never miss anything and would always be there when he said he would be. But where was Gordon? Oh, they would find Gordon, but it wouldn't be of the best way to find him. When Gordon was found, he was found on the morning of the 23rd, so just the next day, and he was found approximately 76 miles from where he should have been. He was also partially buried, off in a deserted, like off of a deserted dirt road that was in Millard County, Utah. Gordon had been beaten to death, and he was buried underneath a twisted, dead tree. Just kind of left there like garbage off the side of the road. Now, if you think about this, like I mentioned at the beginning of this is very similar to another case. That is correct. But this murder would happen 10 years after Gordon's death. That murder is that of Matthew Shepard. They are extremely similar, even down to being tied up to a gate in the middle of nowhere. The biggest differences are that Gordon was already dead and Matthew was still alive when they found him. And one was charged as a hate crime and one wasn't. It's very hard to kind of think about and fathom that one would be charged as a hate crime and one wouldn't, but that's because of the time that this happened. Obviously, Gordon Reed Church died in 1988. Matthew Shepard would die in the late 90s. So you have to think, wow, there's not a lot of LGBT rights at the time that Gordon died. So a lot of things aren't viewed the same way they were 10 years later. There's also another huge difference as well. And this is the fact that one of the perpetrators in the Gordon Reed Church murder would be the one to lead his parole officer to the scene of the crime with the sheriff and also with his attorney. As he would point out the crime scene and where the body was, this is when all of the authoritative figures present would come to realize that the person that led them to this poor man's body had more to do with the crime than he let on. So this man I'm talking about, his name is Lance Wood. So Lance Wood told his parole officer that he witnessed Michael Archuleta kill Gordon Reed Church and bury him after torturing him. But you see, that simply was not the case. Oh no. So these two men, Michael Archuleta and Lance Wood, were actually just recently paroled from prison. Clearly, the idea of rehabilitating them for their crimes while serving their sentences did not work because they ultimately reoffended, as most do. Archuleta just got released for drug offenses, and Lance Wood was released after serving his 1 year sentence following his conviction in connection to stealing a motorcycle and then crashing it just after he turned 18. So even without them committing this murder, they violated their paroles. And this was simply by living in Cedar City with their girlfriends. And also they're living together. If I'm not mistaken, under certain parole restrictions, you're not allowed to live in the same area unless it's a halfway house with another person that is also on parole, because that's an automatic violation. But I think it also depends on the state. Anywho, let's get back to this. So, needless to say, they would have ended up back in prison either way. But to set the scene, let's go back to when they met Gordon Ray Church. So, Lance Wood and Michael Archuleta went to the same 7-Eleven to pick up some soda so they could mix it with their whiskey. You know, just a simple soda just to, soften the blow of whiskey. This is when they would cross paths with Gordon Ray Church. Gordon Ray Church was in his car outside of the 7-Eleven. This is when the other two ended up going up to him and talking to him. And Gordon Ray Church is in his white Thunderbird, his white Ford Thunderbird, a nice car for this dude in just outside of a 7-Eleven. I'm sure you're kind of putting two and two together of what may or could have happened. So I'm sure they probably asked Gordon for a ride, and as they proceeded down the street, they told him to pull over because there's some women that were, walking down the street so they could talk to them. These two women are also said to be with the three men in the car during the whole process of the pickup to the murder, but that's allegedly. I think one said to put these two women in the car as like a crutch or an alibi, if you will. So, following them being picked up by Gordon, this is when the three would drive to Cedar Canyon and park the car. And during testimony at the trial, this is when it's said that Gordon told them that he was gay. And now this is when the stories change. So, Lance Wood says something different, and so does Michael Archuleta. Lance Wood said that they initially planned to rob Gordon, which I would assume based on his car, but because he was gay, Michael Archuleta said that didn't happen. Michael Archuleta also said that he was going to have sex with Gordon, but when Gordon asked him to use a condom, this made him stop. I would assume it probably made him angry or angered him at some point. Some men like to go bareback. I know that's really gross to hear, but they do. They like the feeling of it all. And when there's plastic evading their space, they can't get the full feeling. Whatever. Lance Wood says that Michael then forced Gordon at knife point, and during his forceful sexual encounter with Gordon, that's when he asked Lance if he wanted some. Now, keep in mind that Gordon is a very small man. He's about 150 pounds, only about 5'5" in height. He really reminds me of a case that I previously covered from here in New England, which is also very sad because that was also a hate crime. But so Gordon would have been extremely easy to pin down and to be taken advantage of due to his size and due to the size of these two men. From pictures I've seen, they are bigger, they're more bulkier than Gordon Ray Church would have been. So this attack would continue outside of the Ford Thunderbird when Gordon would be then tackled to the ground, and in the process of this, the lower left portion of his jaw and his arm would be broken because of the force. He then would be bound with a bungee cord and some tire chains that were in the trunk of his own car, and then he would be put in the trunk of the car. Gordon was still coherent during this whole thing. I need you guys to understand that. Gordon was still, he knew what was happening. He could see what he was experiencing. So I'm sure if he had lived, he would have been able to retell what was happening to him as well, which is very, very sad. But it only gets worse from here. So, this is then when he would go into detail during trial about how Michael Archuleta bound Gordon with the bungee cord and the tire chains and literally like shove him into the car before they proceeded to drive north about 80 miles on the I-15. And they would stop about an hour later in an area called Dog Valley, which is in Millard County. So how brutal this crime would be would only continue in this new area. After they took Gordon out of the trunk of the car, this is when they would attach battery cables to him and attempt to electrocute him before they would beat him severely over the head with a tire iron and a tire jack. It said from the court documents and the records that the injuries that he sustained to his skull were that of looking like he had been run over by a truck. They were so severe, the medical examiner testified to this, that it was so severe and similar to that of being run over in the head. They then would take his body and drag him up a hillside and bury him beneath a dead tree, a dead twisted tree, in a shallow grave. Now, after they bury him, they go back to the car and they then would leave the crime scene. They would head more north on the I-15 before abandoning his car in Salt Lake City. Gordon's car, that is. Now, mind you, they're covered in blood. They would go to a thrift store and buy some clothes. The clerk kind of would look at them funny, like, what? But Michael would tell them that they were just on a rabbit hunting trip and from the night before, and that's why they needed new clothes because they didn't bring any other clothes, so they needed new ones. That's why they're at the thrift store. Following this is when they would dump their clothes in a ditch in Salt Lake County, and then they would hitchhike back to Cedar City. Then they were back home. But this is when Lance Wood would freak out because he just severely violated his parole. They killed somebody. They buried him. What are they going to do? So he then talks to his parole officer about how Michael Archuleta killed somebody less than a day after they had left Gordon Ray Church's body in Dog Valley. So within the early hours of November 24th, this is when, like how I told you at the beginning, Lance Wood would go with his parole officer, the Iron County Sheriff, also his attorney, to the crime scene. And, this is when they realized, hey, he knows more and is more involved with this than we realize. Yeah, yeah. The sheriff also said that it was right before Thanksgiving, so obviously this is a tough time, and it made it more difficult to investigate. And the ultimate brutality of this case as well is what also made it difficult. Lance was initially arrested as a material witness, I will say that. And this was after he tried to run off, following leading them there, which doesn't fully make sense why he would try to run off, but maybe he freaked out because he could see the look in their eye, like, hey, he's not telling me the full truth. And it didn't take these authority figures very long to, like, fully get him out of it and to pick up Michael Archuleta. It was said that there was so much blood spatter at the scene, it literally gave Lancewood away. Like, there was the way he was talking about the crime, the way he was motioning about the crime, it said that you could tell he was involved, deeply involved in this crime. So, shortly after this is when Michael Archuleta would be arrested in Cedar City and he would be put on what's called a parole hold, which is when you violate your parole. The area as well that they're in, Millard County, is not really known for violent crimes. Um, there was maybe one or two murders every few years in this area. And this area is also very small. The county itself only had 11,700 people back in 1988. That's not a lot of people. Like the town I lived in during the main years of schooling for me had about 4,000 people in it. So there's not a lot of people in that small county, if you think about that. And I mean, I'm here on the East Coast, and that is in the Pacific Southwest, Utah, or on the Pacific Coast, if you will. Yeah. All of this together, if you think about it, Gordon's gay, small community, beaten to death, buried. His family's from a devoutly LDS family. Obviously, this would make it completely like severely difficult for the church community in this area. And not just his family, Gordon Ray Church's family, but the actual LDS church, all the families that participate in it in the community, because his family was very well known throughout Delta and throughout the county. They knew his family. A lot of people were affected by it. They were really well respected in the community, and everybody had love for this family. So for somebody to just take away this son of this prominent family was crazy. This trial would take place about 13 months after the murder, so in December of 1989. And this is due to the fact of having a change of venue. It was granted for both of the separate trials for Archuleta and for Wood because of how well known Gordon Ray Church was in the community. It was easier for them to pack up their stuff, like the case, and move it up to Utah County for the trial. Now, shortly after the movement from county to county, this is when Lance Wood's trial would begin in January of 1990. So both of these trials, Lance Wood and Michael Archuleta would push the responsibility of the murder onto the other one. Archuleta's attorneys would attempt to put the blame fully on Lance Wood, but Lance Wood's defense would portray Michael Archuleta as being that crime person, that person that's been the ringleader, heavily in crime for most of their life, and would say that Lance Wood waited in the car quietly. But here's the thing. They both had blood on them, on their bodies, on their clothes. They, even with them putting the responsibility back and forth on one another, they had a ton of physical evidence that would tie both of them back to the scene. So they knew both of them that were there. There was blood found on Michael Archuleta's jacket and on Lance Wood's shoes. There was hair from Gordon Ray Church in Lance Wood's shoelaces. So clearly they tied him to certain things to the crime scene. There's no way of him getting out of it. They also determined that the cuts that were on Gordon Ray Church's back were caused by a dull-tipped instrument, similar to side cutters, red-handled side cutters, that were actually found in Lance Wood's jeans. Interesting, right? So that means that he had something to do with it. Both of these men were charged with one count of murder. It also included a charge of aggravated sexual assault and kidnapping. But this was never charged as a hate crime because they couldn't prove that this crime was sexual orientation motivated. Also, like I mentioned before, hate crime laws didn't really exist until about 3 years after this in 1992. So the evidence was there, and it's during this trial that Lance Wood told the police during his interview, it would come out that Michael said he wanted to rob Gordon Ray Church because he was gay. In the second trial, so obviously we have trials back to back because they're tried separately. In the second trial, Lance Wood would testify again, saying that Gordon was gay and he wanted to take all of his money because of it. But here's the thing. They can't prove They can't prove it. Like, you imagine if you set up the scene, they first meet him with the Ford Thunderbird, he's got a nice car and want to take everything he has, you know what I mean? But there was no way for them to actually prove that's what they did. The only thing they could prove is that they sexually assaulted him and then murdered him. They beat him and murdered him and buried him. Yeah, this crime is very hard to fully take in itself because of the context, because of the time it happened, because of crimes that happened after this that are extremely similar, and it really puts a toll, like takes a toll on your brain when you think about it. Ultimately, the prosecution in Michael Archuleta's case as the main antagonist worked, and he was sentenced to death. Lance Wood then would receive a smaller sentence of life in prison, which both of them, in my opinion, should have gotten the death sentence, but it's one of those things that you have to just come to terms with when it comes to sentencing. And it's not us that has to come to terms with it, it's Gordon Ray Church's family that has to come to terms with it. I will say that following his, sentence and going to prison, Lance Wood did actually get married. He accomplished one of his goals that he wanted to do with his life. He said that he wanted to finish high school and eventually get married after being rehabilitated from going to prison when he was younger. And he ended up getting married to this girl named Renee McKenzie. She's also the ex-wife of a state senator for Idaho that she left to marry Lance Wood, which is, in my opinion, interesting, but wow, strange. And she eventually would help him with his paperwork in order to kind of like fight his crime, if you will, or to try and, what is it called? Where his, oh, appeal. To help him with his appeals. But Lance Wood's not really like the nicest man ever. He also was accused of having inappropriate relations with different prison employees while he was in prison during the time of his marriage. Yeah. Um, so correction. Mackenzie Renee Mackenzie, sorry. Sorry I said her name backwards. She was working as a paralegal at her ex-husband's law firm. She hadn't left him yet when she agreed to help Lance Wood fight his case. And that's when his case against a DOC employee who accused him of harassment. And this complaint would be filed with the district court in Portland. This is when they would begin to have a romantic relationship while she was preparing the documentation for his trial. And nobody monitored them. Nobody was watching them. And it was about a year into her working with him that their affair was revealed. She was investigated for practicing law without a license. She was never charged with anything, though. After this is when Lance Wood would be transferred to another facility in Oregon, and they then would get married in 2015. They also would file a lawsuit seeking $50 million in compensatory and punitive damages based on what the backlash they received from the Idaho DOC staff as they with their, corrupt prison system. That case is still pending currently, and that was filed back in 2015. It's 2024. Michael Archuleta has not stopped fighting his death penalty since he got his decision from the 4th District Court. And after 30 years, he is very close to his execution. He came close to facing it back in 2012, but there was an appeal on it based on like his counsel, that his counsel was ineffective. It was rejected by the Supreme Court in 2011, and this is when his death sentence was halted by, in in my opinion, he actually has the coolest death penalty, which is firing squad. Um, but his death penalty was halted due to him deciding to pursue an appeal with the federal court. Yeah. Um, in his appeal, it said that the Fourth District Court eventually decided to dismiss the previous appeals, claiming that he was ineligible for execution, and this is on the grounds of him being intellectually disabled. They presented evidence to the court about Archuleta's disability and showing that, they can't execute him for this, which can work in some cases, if you will. But due to the fact of his background, him living, like being born in deplorable conditions to about the time when he was 16 years old, um, he was actually in the custody of Charitable Trust and in the custody of the LDS Church, which I would assume that's how he would have met Lance Wood as well, because he also is a part of the LDS, which makes me assume that they possibly even knew Gordon Ray Church as well. But they took into consideration his background. When they first found him when he was 3, he was in a filthy home. He was taken into custody and he was also covered in cigarette burns. He then was put into foster care. He then was adopted. He suffered from ADHD. He was sexually assaulted at multiple different state hospitals, mental health facilities. And there after all of this would come out, they would have a evaluation done in 2006 in which they would conclude that he suffers from impairment, neurocognitive impairment that affects his ability to write anything. And unfortunately, it wasn't enough to prove that he was intellectually disabled, which is unfortunate. I mean, if you actually read into his background and things like that, you will feel bad for him for his upbringing, but that still doesn't give him way for what he did to Gordon Ray Church. All right, so needless to say, Michael Archuleta is still facing the death penalty. He is appealing it with 5 other inmates currently, but and things could be brought by the Supreme Court. One day he will face his execution after furthering the delay of this, but that's one day. Gordon Ray Church was buried in Delta Cemetery in Delta, Utah. Um, his death was not needed. It was something that, and is something that realistically should have been charged as a hate crime. Both of the men, Michael Archuleta and Lance Wood, should have gotten the death penalty, both of them. Wood should not have just gotten life in parole. I don't believe so. I believe he should have gotten the death penalty. And there's a cowardice that you see when it comes to 2 individuals committing murder, where one plays the victim, one's not the victim. One plays the victim because they were forced to do something. I don't believe that he was coerced in any way to do any of the things that he did. He did them of his own fruition, and I don't say this to be malicious. I say this because it's my own opinion. Most of the time in cases like this, there are people that will say that the other one is the one that indeed is responsible for the crime that, they're being charged with, and they'll play the victim card. But in this case, I don't believe he was the victim. I believe that because they both tried to pin it on each other, obviously there's more to the story than we know. There's more to the story that we don't understand because it hasn't fully been talked about. We know about all the issues that Michael Archuleta has. We know about the issues that Lance Wood has from childhood. But why would they simply just pin it on each other? That's the problem I have with this. But yeah, that is the murder of Gordon Ray Church. It's a very harsh murder. It's something that like I say about most cases, it shouldn't have happened because, he was just a young man that was trying to live his life, and he was just gonna go have some dinner with his friends before Thanksgiving, before going back to see his family. And unfortunately, he can't do that because he was murdered. So, yeah, I hope you guys learn from most of the crimes, or learn a little something about most of the crimes that I talk about here on Untold Crimes and Crimes Untold, because a lot of them are really ghastly and shouldn't have, they just shouldn't happen. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in my next one. Bye, you guys.